Welcome everyone. My name is Professor Leanne Wiseman. I'm a Professor of Intellectual Property Law at Griffith University and also an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. Firstly, I would like to give acknowledgement to country that we acknowledge Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians on the land upon which we meet today. We pay respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'd like to welcome you all here today and thank you very much for coming in person. And I would like to especially thank all of the people who have joined us online tonight. We have almost 200 people. It would be great to have you virtually here in the room with us here in Brisbane, but thank you very much for joining us. What is so pleasing to see that a topic such as this, repairers competition, has drawn interest internationally from Australia, from a whole range of different sectors and industries. We have representatives from government, from industries such as the electronic and electrical industry, automotive, agricultural industries, medical device and assistive technology industries. We have community repairers from all over Australia, which is wonderful to see here tonight as well as online. We have academics from a number of different universities and it's great to see such a broad industry base as well as academic and policy making group together here to hear Anthony tonight. The order of proceedings is essentially that we have the Honourable Dr. Andrew Lee to give a welcome tonight for an introduction and welcome for Anthony's talk tonight. Then Anthony will speak and then we have the Honourable Pat Keane who will give some comments afterwards and then we'll have a question and answer session. So to begin, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Dr. Andrew Lee, which is a pre-recorded introduction for us here tonight. He's the Assistant Minister for Competition and Charities and Treasury and also the Assistant Minister for Employment. Andrew is particularly close to this debate given that he was the minister largely responsible for our first right to repair law here in Australia, which is a mandatory data sharing law in the automotive industry, which really sees an open and fair playing field for our independent repairers here in Australia. Thank you, Andrew.
I acknowledge the elders, customs and traditions of the Yagara and the Turrbal people from both sides of the Maiwar, and all First Nations people present today. I'd like to thank Griffith University Law Futures Centre for inviting me to provide opening remarks ahead of the lecture by Assistant Professor Anthony Rosborough. I thank Professor Leanne Wiseman for organising this event and bringing everyone together, including students, researchers and policymakers, to consider the right to repair through the lens of competition policy and market power. Having had the pleasure of speaking at your 2022 Australian Repair Summit, it's terrific to be joining you again. To those of you attending today, thank you for advocating on behalf of Australian consumers and small businesses. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Australia's groundbreaking Trade Practices Act 1974, now the Competition and Consumer Act 2010, and the establishment of the Trade Practices Commission, the forerunner to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. The first chair of the Trade Practices Commission, Ron Bannerman, was a famously frugal man. According to one of his colleagues, many a Trade Practices Commission officer lay low in their Commonwealth car at airports as the car sped past Bannerman, who was walking to the bus stop carrying his suitcase. Born in 1921, Bannerman was a make-do-and-mend type of person, representative of that generation that lived through the Depression and World War II. And that's why, if he was still with us, I think he'd be a proponent of the right to repair movement. Namely, the right to access easier and cheaper options to repair products that are technically repairable. Breakdown is normal and often inevitable. so too is the human impulse to fix things. 50 years ago, when a car broke down, the repair process might involve lifting the hood, getting hands-on, doing it yourself. I know that's what I sometimes did with my first car, a 1976 Mustang Baxalica. But you wouldn't be trying it today. Today's cars are computers on wheels, managed by electronic control units and millions of lines of code. Fixing them requires real-time access to complex and unique data. And that's why we need to intervene with a right to repair. Australia now has the Motor Vehicle Service and Repair Information Sharing Scheme, which I was pleased to announce in July 2022 as one of my first actions as Assistant Minister for Competition. That scheme, which is Australia's first right to repair law, requires motor vehicle service and repair information to be made available for purchase by Australian repairers at a fair market price. Given the scheme's the first of its kind in Australia, our government is monitoring for implementation issues and are committed to ensuring the scheme remains fit for purpose. The Australian government will continue collaborating with the automotive sector to ensure our nation has world-leading right to repair laws. There are set consumer rights to a repair or replacement when a product has a major problem. But the ever-increasing complexity of a rising number of products is locking out independent technicians and other manufacturer-adjacent businesses. The lockout undermines competition and concentrates power in the hands of original equipment manufacturers. This can include anything embedded with sophisticated technology, not just cars and farm equipment, but our phones, watches, washing machines, medical devices and exercise equipment. Sometimes these products are single-use. For example, think of batteries or printer cartridges. Quite often the product is also blanketed by fine print, stating that repairs by non-certified repairers will void the warranty. The result for consumers is product lock-in. Consumers are channelled into an expensive aftermarket. The unfortunate side effect is that it's often cheaper to replace the whole product than fix a small component. That can lead to tons of unnecessary waste and landfill. The biennial 2022 National Waste Report found that Australians generated around 3 tonnes of waste per person. That figure was up by 3% compared to the previous report. The report also found that Australia's recycling rate remains stagnant at 60%. Rates of recycling and recovery are highest for metals, 87%, and building materials, 81%. Rates are lowest for textiles, 21%, and plastics at just 13%. We need to pull our weight and our waste. For independent technicians and small businesses, the competition lockout means fewer repair opportunities. The 2020 High Court case of Caladad versus Seiko Epson relating to Epson printer cartridges found that Australians do have a right to repair under the doctrine of exhaustion, as applied to Australian patent law. The High Court decision was a win for Caladad, which bought old single-use Epson printer cartridges and refurbished, reprogrammed, rebranded and refilled them. Patrick Keane, one of the justices in the Caladad case prior to his retirement in 2022, will speak in more detail about the matter after Assistant Professor Roxburgh's lecture. What I'll say about the Caladad matter is that for consumers it led to better prices. The original Epson cartridge pack cost $129, while Caladad's equivalent cost $75. Excessive market concentration can also lead to economic problems. We know that dominant firms in a market may have less incentive to carry out research and development and less incentive to produce new products. For example, too much market power might lead to a printer company having little or even no incentive to create reusable cartridges that are more environmentally friendly and cheaper to buy. Two recent government reports highlight the vital link between economic dynamism and innovation. The 2023 Intergenerational Report made the point that most Australian businesses adopt innovations created by others. It says this underscores the importance of having settings that facilitate the diffusion of new technologies and ideas throughout the economy. On the 27th of March, the House Standing Committee on Economics, chaired by Daniel Molino, delivered their report, Better Competition, Better Prices, which focuses on promoting economic dynamism, competition and business formation. The report emphasises the need to continuously assess competition settings to maintain economic dynamism. The right to repair movement, increased digitalisation and the net zero transformation present opportunities and challenges. The opportunities will come from creativity in aftermarkets. They may be similar to the resourcefulness displayed by Caladad in reusing printer cartridges. The challenges will continue coming from the notion of creative destruction, brought about by the process of old ideas being displaced by new ones. This brings to mind examples such as Fairphone, a Dutch smartphone brand that makes repairable headsets, headphones and earbuds. Its focus on reducing e-waste and giving more users more control over repairs. Or adventure clothing company Patagonia, which encourages its customers to repair clothing rather than throw it away. As well as offering online repair tips, Patagonia has trained its retail staff in conducting simple repairs and operates one of the largest garment repair factories in North America. This sits alongside the important work that my colleague Tanya Plibersek is doing on product stewardship. The Environment Minister's priority list identifies her current priorities for product stewardship action. Industry is expected to take action for the products on the list. The Minister reviews the list annually to see if the recommended actions have been taken. If action is not taken, the Minister may consider regulating the products, which in turn can be more onerous for industry. The priority list currently comprises 5 products: clothing textiles, tyres, plastics and healthcare products in hospitals, mattresses and child car seats. Meanwhile, other items, including single-use plastics, electronic products and oil containers, have been taken off the list because industry has made sufficient progress to manage the environmental impact. In closing, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the right to repair. Done right, with a recognition of intellectual property rights, innovation and public safety, the right to repair will save consumers time and money. Alongside this, our government is advancing an ambitious competition agenda in other areas. This includes revitalising national competition policy, holding an Australian Competition and Consumer Commission inquiry into supermarkets, reviewing the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct, progressing merger reforms, and reviewing the impact of non-compete clauses and other worker restraint clauses. I thank you for your interest in these issues. I'm sure Assistant Professor Rosborough will provide salient insights on Canada's experience that we can learn from here in Australia. Thanks very much.
It's so excellent to have Andrew Lee as a supporter of the right to repair movement. It is wonderful to see the difference that has made in our automotive market. I'm sure that all of you may realise that you can now take your car to an independent repairer and they will be able to access the information that they need, which has really monumentally changed the aftermarket here in Australia. Next, I would like to introduce Anthony. Anthony, would you like to come up? Anthony Rosborough is an assistant professor of law and computer science at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He teaches and writes at the intersection of ubiquitous computing, intellectual property law, regulatory theory, and science and technology policy. Much of Anthony's work is focused on the relationships between law, technology, and society. And a central theme of his research is examinations of the way in which software, computerization, and IoT, or the Internet of Things, connectivity, are used to create new concepts of ownership and access in an increasing connected and automated world. Along these lines, the right to repair is a core focus of Anthony's work. Anthony is completing his PhD at the European Institute University in Florence at the moment, and Anthony is also a close friend and a colleague, the co-founder of Can Repair, the Canadian Repair Coalition, alongside with the Australian Repair Network that we have founded. We're kind of, the dynamic duo, really. Canada and Australia have a lot to do, have a lot in common with our strong agricultural and geography, really, the challenges that we face. So I'm really pleased to invite Anthony to talk to you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks. Wow. Thanks so much, Leanne. That's very kind words. Okay, I'm just going to get myself moving here. So thank you so much for having me here. It's truly an honor to be invited and to share some of my thoughts and perspective on the right to repair. The warmth and hospitality of everyone here in Australia has been absolutely incredible. It's been a lifelong dream to make it here. Both my wife and I sort of feel like it's been a long dream to make it here and experience it. And I'm thankful for Leanne's invitation and from the invitation from Griffith University. So thank you so much. Thank you all of you who are here today in person and from those online as well, taking some time out of your day to join in on this. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. Of course, pay respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And in the same spirit, and as a guest from Canada, I would like to also acknowledge the Mi'kmaq people, the original inhabitants and custodians of the land where I come from and call home, Nova Scotia. The Mi'kmaq have a deep and enduring connection to their lands and waters, and I honor their history, culture, and contributions. And so in recognizing both the traditional custodians of this land and the land of the Mi'kmaq people of my homeland, I'm reminded of the importance of honoring the histories and cultures and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples all around the world. Personal note, I thought I'd begin by briefly touching upon why the right to repair matters to me. I was lucky to have a very industrious and adventurous childhood building and fixing things. And part of this stems from coming from a family of boat builders, but also my love of sailing and rebuilding motorbikes. I spent a good chunk of my younger years of life with my Uncle Kevin, who's taught me all sorts of repair and maintenance skills. And he's taught me that nothing that humans can do or make can't be figured out, diagnosed, or fixed by other humans. And so given this upbringing, when I first started to learn about the right to repair, it immediately resonated with me. And as someone with a deep appreciation for restoration and preservation and making old things work again, and I know we have folks in the audience who that's much of what they do, I always thought of the right to repair as being really personally connected to my values and family. So I really feel that repair is something that makes us more resilient as people. It gives us hope in the future, and it makes us care more for our world and for one another. And looking at the world today, I think those are all very, very important things that we should safeguard and cherish. Okay, so for an overview of the talk today, I thought we'd start with sort of some common characterizations of the right to repair, and sort of we'll unpack, why that is particularly relevant to the discussion today. So looking at revealing some blind spots by certain characterizations of the right to repair, and particularly when we look at consumer guarantees as the sole focus, and sort of looking at how we can characterize right to repair in a way that might look more to market competition and that rationale as being primarily important. The idea being that would reveal some of the blind spots that are left by the consumer focus and addressing sort of more of the root causes of unrepairability. And also looking at competition-oriented policy solutions, particularly looking at ways to prevent what we might call lock-ins and preventing lockouts. So we heard Dr. Andrew Lee talk a little bit about lockouts and sort of ways that independent aftermarkets are prevented from participating in repair. So we'll then also examine a little bit of Canada's proposed bills C-59, 244, and 294 as some examples of competition-oriented policy solutions. And then finally, yeah, we'll conclude with some concluding thoughts and hopefully have a bit of an engaging discussion at the very end. So some of you may be familiar with this image. It's known as the duck rabbit, and it was famously used by philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And linguistic philosophy is not the topic of today's talk, thankfully. I don't think that's what anyone came for. But what the duck rabbit illustrates is how different people can perceive the same thing in different ways. So some see a duck, others see a rabbit. Personally, I'm more in the duck camp. But Wittgenstein used the image to show that our perception is not just about what we see, but it's also how we interpret it and the meaning we ascribe to it. So the same concept or visual stimulus can be understood in multiple ways, depending on our perspective. And I wanted to start today's talk off by comparing the right to repair as the duck rabbit in some ways. There are quite a few possible interpretations of what the right to repair means and the meaning we give to it. So one of the earliest and longest standing characterizations of the right to repair might be called the educational or knowledge diffusion rationale. So deeply ingrained in the right to repair movement are these values of open source and open access. And so the inputs necessary for repair, be they parts, tools, information, or software, are all kind of at their core, all forms of information. And that information can be used to develop new knowledge and understanding, but only if we have access to it. So the resources necessary for repair enable us to analytically engage with and understand products and devices. So in learning how they work, we can also learn how they can be improved or different uses for which they can be put. So this is the Linksys WRT router that was built on open source software and was used for all sorts of innovation projects. So this is a robot that someone made and attached wheels to it with drill motors. Just an example. So under the education and knowledge diffusion conceptualization of right to repair, these activities are valuable for diffusing technical knowledge throughout society and bridging the digital divide. And so the propensity to repair and maintain things is kind of like a muscle, and when we do more of it and we get better at it, we learn new things. When we do less of it, that muscle kind of atrophies and we become more reliant on centralized systems and manufacturers to provide those services for us. The second rationale for the right to repair or characterization might be the one that's the most obvious and frequently referenced for good reasons, and that's that repair helps us move towards greater sustainability. So it's well known that many of the products and devices that surround us require an enormous amount of energy and raw materials to produce, and the disposal of those products, often premature, long before they are no longer useful, causes further ecological and human harms in their reclamation. So electronics waste is one of the fastest growing streams of waste globally, doubling since 2010, with annual estimates in 2023 of about 62 million metric tons in that year. And so to put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to 564 of your average size cruise ship in just 1 year of solid waste. So the sustainability rationale for the right to repair often leads to an emphasis on product design for repair, extending the useful lifespan of products, waste disposal regulation, recycling. And so, for example, the European Parliament study estimates that extending the average lifespan of a smartphone by just 1 year would save 2.1 million annual tons of CO2 by 2030. So as will be discussed a bit more later on, it's this conceptualization of the right to repair that has influenced much of the European Union's policy solutions, and it's a tremendously important aspect and goal of the unrepairability problem, without a doubt. The third characterization for the right to repair is probably the one that resonates with most of the people here today on a personal level. I'm sure we all have our own story of frustration when it comes to repair. A vacuum cleaner that the manufacturer won't provide parts for, a cordless drill that stopped working a week after the warranty expired, a smartphone touchscreen that's glued to the battery and more costly to replace than just getting a new phone altogether. So these stories are endless, and they have been a driving force of government right to repair policy around the world, including Canada and including Australia. And it's easy to see why this characterization has been so influential and powerful. After all, consumers are voters, and consumers also speak with their wallets, so manufacturers listen too. But this fourth characterization will be kind of the bigger focus of our attention today. And this fourth characterization is really on the market competition and innovation aspects. So greater access to parts, tools, information, and software enables independent businesses in aftermarkets to carry out their work. So often these independent repairers are better able to provide service in remote and rural parts of the world. So we could think of, in Canada's case, our Northwest Territories, or perhaps in Australia, the Northern Territory. Independent repair businesses overwhelmingly produce local jobs, so within small and medium-sized enterprises. So these are kind of exactly what we want when we think of structuring an economy. So everything from consumer electronics to agricultural equipment to medical devices to cars, the same resources needed for independent repair also enable follow-on innovation. So this means that developing new products or solutions that make existing technologies more useful or extend their lifespan. So in Canada, for example, we have, you can see on the bottom left here, this is a honeybee header that attaches to a John Deere combine. It's produced by a small Canadian company in a small town that employs more or less everyone that lives in that town, and they produce products that work with dominant platforms that offer unique solutions. So it's just an example of when we have the resources for repair, that same access to diagnostic software, or the ability to circumvent some encryption, we're able to produce things that are truly valuable and make products more useful. And so the competition rationale for the right to repair is really important because across much of the developed world, we're experiencing a real lack of competition in many markets. And this includes things like grocery stores. I mean, it's funny, being here in Australia and you see the kind of same dynamics as we see in Canada with the same kind of, there's two dominant players in every market, it seems. And it also includes online retailers like Amazon, for example, but also within the automotive industry and within medical devices especially, and of course, agricultural equipment. So we see this across many industries. So these different characterizations of the right to repair are not just rhetorical devices or ways of thinking about the problem of unrepairability. They're also ways of thinking about the solutions to the problem. So in terms of policy reforms, we end up crafting solutions that mirror the way we think of the problem. So in the case of the sustainability and circularity rationale for the right to repair, the result is sort of an emphasis on product manufacturing standards, product stewardship schemes where the manufacturer remains ultimately responsible for the products at the end of their life, or banning the use of certain types of products that are difficult or impossible to repair, and other incentives and rebates for independent repairs. And this approach plays strongly really in the EU's approach to the right to repair in particular, and it has influenced policy development elsewhere. So in Canada's 2021 budget, for example, there was an introduction of tax credits for home appliance repairs with a maximum of $500. So these types of incentives that focus in that direction. And similarly, the consumer rights rationale generally results in a set of common solutions. It focuses mostly on consumer guarantees, warranties, and information given to consumers at the time of sale. And this could mean ensuring that warranties remain valid after independent repairs are carried out. It could mean guaranteed timeframes for manufacturers to provide parts, tools, and information to consumers. And this is a very prominent approach to policy solutions to the right to repair around the world. We see it playing a large role really in the United States and the EU's frameworks in different ways. But finally, the market competition rationale for the right to repair results in a set of solutions that are simple to kind of imagine and say, but perhaps more difficult and politically charged to implement. So we'll look at the market competition solutions in greater detail in the next sort of section, but at a very high level, these solutions are oriented differently than the first two. So rather than mandating or regulating manufacturers to take certain actions to facilitate repair, they restrict and prevent manufacturers from engaging in certain activities that tend to make repair more difficult or expensive in the first place. So this requires a kind of recalibration to competition law and their interaction with various intellectual property laws. Why the focus on a market competition right to repair? There are long-standing debates about the role and purpose of competition law, but recognizing that folks in this audience will have varying levels of familiarity and appetite for getting into those details. Simply put, competition law is about maintaining and encouraging competition to ensure that businesses each have an equitable opportunity to participate in the economy and to provide consumers with competitive prices and choices. So when we talk about market competition right to repair, we're talking less about a right that's afforded to individual consumers and more so a right that applies to perhaps small and medium-sized enterprises, maybe even larger businesses, but also public institutions and organizations, some of which might be nonprofit organizations. So a lack of competition for repair will mean that the choices will be slimmer and costs will be higher. So in this end, it sort of impacts us, it impacts consumers as well. It's sort of like a rising tide that lifts all boats, if you will. And so before we delve into the market competition right to repair in greater detail, it's important to explain how intellectual property rights form part of this picture. So when it comes to how IP rights can play a role in preventing repairs, I'm sure that many of us have heard or read about the issues farmers face with today's tractors and combines. And Dr. Andrew Lee's talk sort of mentioned some of these challenges as well in relation to the automotive industry. These are heavily computerized machines with onboard computers and hundreds of sensors that collect data, but also report on machine diagnostics necessary for repairs. And this serves as a good example of how just one piece of equipment and the special resources needed for repairs can implicate many different IP rights. So here we have the X9 combine, the diagnostic software, and the service advisor kit, the sort of black thing on the bottom left. And that kit allows the physical connection between a laptop computer and the combine, and all of these resources are needed to diagnose and authorize repairs once they're completed. And so this is just a small selection of the IP rights at play here, but you can see that, you know, the copyright sort of is implicated when it comes to the onboard software and diagnostic software. That when it comes to encryption and passwords, these could be governed by technological protection measures, a kind of creature of copyright, which we'll talk a bit more about. The Deere logo and distinctive green and yellow cover could be sort of protected by trademarks. The physical components of the machine by patents. The aesthetic and placement controls in the cabin layout could be design rights. And trade secrets, again, for the data protocols and physical interfaces. So we've got the whole kind of the whole menu of intellectual property rights applying to just one simple sort of repair activity. So the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that when we're talking about parts, tools, and information and software necessary for repair, we're not just talking about things that are hard to get your hands on or are expensive. We're also talking about things that the manufacturer holds exclusive rights to, and they can choose whether or not you can have access to it. And whether independent technicians, for that matter, can have access to them. And these IP rights operate as a kind of remote control, and they determine who can carry out repairs, when and at what cost. And it's mostly these dynamics that bring competition law into the mix. What these IP rights enable are for manufacturers to establish and protect what we might think of as exclusive channels of distribution. So repair becomes a type of market commodity that's owned exclusively by manufacturers. And so when barriers to repair take shape around access to parts, tools, and information, these IP rights are really what enable those exclusive distribution channels to take shape. An example of the ways in which these IP rights can filter down into repair restrictions, some of you may be familiar with the Norwegian case of Heinrich Husby, who was a kind of a one-man iPhone repair shop in Norway. As part of his business, he imported refurbished iPhone replacement screens from Asia. So these are originally manufactured Apple screens that were either defective or broken and had been refurbished and brought back to like a new condition. And importantly, the assembly includes a very tiny ribbon cable. So the screen has a cable attached to it that connects to the actual, the rest of the device. And that ribbon cable has Apple's trademark printed on it. And you can see a comparison in these two images between the non-original one and the original one with the very small Apple logo that's almost, you could say, microscopic. And the presence of these trademarks on the imported refurbished screens was sufficient for Apple to lodge a counterfeit products complaint at the time they were imported into Norway. And under Norwegian trademark law, and this is the same for many other countries, including Canada, and I believe Australia as well, counterfeit goods can be seized at the border. So in Canada, that would be the Canada Border Services Agency. And there's a whole bunch of provisions under our trademark legislation, and I assume the same in Australia for seizing and destroying goods of this nature. And Heinrich himself was sued for $25,000 US or equivalent in damages and in order to destroy all of the phones he repaired using those products. And so the dispute went to trial. It became quite the notorious story in the right to repair world. And Apple eventually won, albeit with a lesser damages award. So it's for reasons like this that focusing on the market competition aspects of right to repair are crucially important. This is because the other dominant approaches, so the consumer or sustainability approaches, they're absolutely essential, but they tend to miss a couple of very fundamental points. The first is that by emphasizing consumer guarantees and product standards alone, we really are only curing the symptoms and not really the disease. So this is because these solutions, for the most part, preserve the manufacturer's exclusive rights and exclusive distribution channels over those important parts, tools, information, and software. So without reining in the exercise of IP and the sort of anti-competitive tactics in association with them, we're not really getting at the source of the problem. And at worst, these consumer law-focused approaches, particularly things like product stewardship when it comes to very complicated devices, may even further strengthen the manufacturer's power to control the resources necessary for repair. Because in the case of product stewardship schemes, for example, there might be a further disincentive to share those exclusive rights or access to parts, tools, and information, or to allow others to participate in that scheme. It creates a sort of, a narrowing effect in terms of who should be participating in that stewardship. Secondly, because these approaches require so much more context and detail specific to certain industries, they almost always require a narrower focus on specific products and devices in specific industries. So they give an opportunity, perhaps, for certain industries to lobby for exceptions or for the scope of policy to be narrowed only to certain products and devices. And so the nature of parts, tools, information, and software can vary so much from industry and product that these approaches have to kind of confine themselves to relatively narrow groups of products by necessity. And often these products are only really a narrow selection of those things that really face kind of pressing public policy issues when it comes to repair. So for example, the European Union's Eco-Design Directive requires that manufacturers provide parts, tools, and information, but only in relation to certain products. Right? So only household appliances, electronic displays, welding equipment, vacuum cleaners, and servers and data storage, which is kind of an odd collection of things, but it shows the kind of narrower focus that is required when we sort of impose these types of obligations on manufacturers. And New York State's right to repair law, which came into effect in 2022, obligates manufacturers to provide, again, parts, tools, information on fair and reasonable terms, but only in relation to smartphones, tablets, and e-readers, laptops and desktop computers, monitors, drones, video game consoles, TVs, and other electronics. So there are many other examples of this type of approach. It's not unique to the EU or New York by any means. I mean, Canada, for example, is currently looking into consumer law frameworks for household appliances, agricultural equipment, and a category it calls electronics, which in my opinion is kind of everything. But there is still this tendency, all around the world in terms of implementing the right to repair is to think about, which products do we want to focus on? And make no mistake, these are huge leaps forward for the right to repair. It's important that we do this. But what these more narrowly focused approaches tend to miss are non-consumer products and devices, and they can have an even bigger impact. So New York's bill, for example, specifically excludes farm equipment, medical equipment, motor vehicles, and commercial or industrial equipment. It also makes explicit that intellectual property rights are not affected at all. So the issue with these approaches is not only that they often result in kind of narrow product categories, but that the categories that they focus on are often limited to kind of very kind of consumer-focused devices and appliances that are not really capturing the whole picture. So the benefits of looking at the right to repair as a market competition issue is that well, for one, it can better address the root causes of unrepairability. And that is those exclusive distribution channels established by manufacturers that keep a tight leash on repair. And a market competition approach, at least in theory, doesn't need to confine itself to certain product categories or industries. This is because competition principles tend to be of general application in a market. And they set rules for conduct in the marketplace in a very broad and all-encompassing way. Okay, so looking to what some type of competition-oriented policy solutions might be, these solutions are not always direct amendments to competition law itself or enforcement of it. But as will be shown, some of these solutions are also rooted in recalibrating the scope of IP rights. And so I'm drawing upon some proposed solutions in Canada, but I by no means is this meant to be, sort of implying that Canada has all of the solutions. In fact, I could do a whole separate talk on why I don't think that's the case. But these solutions, I think, are kind of oriented around competition ideas and innovation that I think are a kind of missing conversation when it comes to the right to repair. So we can more narrowly define the anti-competitive conduct carried out by manufacturers in these situations as part of two categories. The first is what we might call lock-ins, and these are tactics wielded by manufacturers, usually through contracts, that prevent businesses or individuals from choosing an independent technician. So in the case of medical devices, for example, in hospitals, often a discounted purchase price is offered to the hospital contract manager for a device, whether it's an X-ray room or an MRI machine, built by Philips or GE or one of the likes, in exchange for a discounted price in exchange for a long-term exclusive service contract by the manufacturer, sometimes upwards of 10 years, where the hospital is locked into only that service provider for that device. And there could be other terms that narrow the scope of who can repair certain types of devices. And if these restrictions are unnecessarily restrictive or overbroad, they could also result in a type of de facto lock-in, you might say. So when it comes to lock-in that's enforced by a contract with the manufacturer or terms of use or terms of sale, competition law usually treats these restrictions as what we might call tying or bundling in competition language. And the second category of anti-competitive, anti-repair conduct can be thought of as lockouts. And so these are tactics and strategies used by manufacturers to deliberately restrict who may access the necessary resources for repair. So for example, this could be using encrypted diagnostic software on a device that can only be decoded by an authorized technician with a special key code or proprietary cables or connections. And another prominent example of lockouts is parts pairing. This is where the individual components of a device are paired with a central computer and each given unique serial numbers. And if any of the components are changed or replaced, the device will detect that and will need to authorize that change through the use of a special code or software to approve the repair. So the software needs to kind of give you permission to complete the repair. And this is a very prominent technique used across a whole host of technologies. Obviously, agricultural equipment has gotten a lot of attention on this, but this is by no means unique to agricultural equipment. This is kind of prevalent across all types of embedded system devices, anything computerized, everything from smartphones to cars to medical devices, and to even trains, even passenger trains. In 2019, Poland's rail operator bought 11 of these impulse trains from a domestic Polish manufacturer. And after several years of use, it was time for fleet maintenance. And the Polish rail operator issued a tender for the maintenance contract. And it went to the lowest bidder, of course, as most public tenders usually do. And the lowest bidder won by a significant margin, but was not the original manufacturer of the train. And after the service company completed the work on the first train, it found that it wouldn't work at all anymore. And it was immobilized despite there being no real mechanical problems with it. And the service company then brought in some security researchers, you might call white hat hackers, who found that the train had been immobilized through firmware controls set by the manufacturer. So it took a team of these security researchers months to reverse engineer the software and figure out how to put the trains back online. They discovered that the code could detect the serial number of one of the parts that had changed as part of the maintenance, and it required a special code to approve to activate and mobilize the train again. So often when we're thinking of parts pairing and the right to repair, we're thinking about iPhones and washing machines. But in this case kind of shows us that the problem goes deep into even public infrastructure. So we need to think much bigger sometimes when it comes to this, when it comes to these dynamics. So to look at some potential legal solutions to these problems that focus on the market competition aspects, I wanted to take a look at Canada's proposed Bill C-59. So this is an omnibus bill, but part of it amends the Canada's Competition Act. And I'm using this as an example, again, not because I think Canada is kind of the forefront of policy development on these issues, but there are relatively few examples of this type of policy. And it serves as a great example of the type of policy that globally we need to see a stronger emphasis on this approach. So the competition amendments are intended to build upon the existing refusal to deal provisions of the Act and to make it crystal clear that refusing to provide the means of diagnosis or repair is a refusal to deal. And it goes to define the means of diagnosis or repair as including diagnostic and repair information, technical updates, diagnostic software, or tools and any related documentation and service parts. So it's essentially making it more clear that the refusal to provide the means of repair is indeed a refusal to deal. And of course, this is still before the Canadian Senate, so it hasn't yet to receive royal assent, although it's received a lot of favorable support from, for example, our automotive industry. A lot of attention is directed towards supporting this as a laudable goal, if not comprehensive, but still kind of moving in the right direction. So these amendments to the Act do include some caveats. However, not just any refusal to provide the means of repair will be deemed an anti-competitive act. One caveat is that the means of repair in question must be essential or necessary for the repairer's business. In other words, it must be that the inability to obtain the means of repair means that they're effectively locked out of business. So it's a pretty high standard. Secondly, it must be that there's only one or very few sources of the means of repair. So if the parts, tools, and information are readily available or even just really hard to find, that might not be enough. The source of that scarcity must be caused by a lack of competition in the market. And finally, it must be that the refusal to provide the means of repair is likely to negatively impact competition in the repair and servicing market. So in other words, the exclusive distribution of the parts, tools, information, or software must be negatively impacting competitiveness in a broader sense. So Bill C-59's proposed amendments are an example of the type of law and policy we need to see more of. By making a refusal to provide the means of repair or diagnosis very explicitly a refusal to deal and therefore anti-competitive, this makes it much more feasible for the Competition Bureau and Tribunal to actually pursue tactics by manufacturers that result in repair lockouts. The bill is far from perfect. Its approach to solving these problems is really limited to ordering the manufacturer to accept an independent repair business as a customer. And so there could be circumstances where even if ordered to accept an independent repair business as a customer, the terms and the conditions attached to whatever those means of repair are still very prohibitive. So for example, they could be very costly. The manufacturer could still charge a lot of money for them. And they could still come with strict terms attached to them to their use that are very restricted and limited to only what is absolutely necessary to be within the letter of the law. And this is where anti-circumvention law comes into the picture. And I'm sure that many of you have heard of digital locks or digital rights management. TPMs are kind of a bigger and overarching concept that includes all of these techniques. And housed within copyright law, anti-circumvention laws are kind of a set of rules that prevent people from hacking or defeating measures used to protect access to software. And the genesis of these rules goes back to online digital content piracy at the turn of the millennium. But the area of the law has since morphed into something completely different, very different, sometimes called para-copyright, because it's really about something else. And so with so many computerized devices and products that surround us today, seemingly everything is now an embodiment of software and copyright. Our home appliances are computers. We put computers into our bodies with implanted devices, and we put our bodies inside of computers with things like cars and particularly electric vehicles. And in computer science, this sort of paradigm that we're in is sometimes referred to as ubiquitous computing. And it's part of what we sometimes refer to as the Internet of Things, or IoT. And what this means is that seemingly everything that surrounds us today is imbued with copyright governance. And if we want to diagnose or fix things, access or manipulation of that software is often involved, and that can be a violation of copyright law itself. So in cases where manufacturers cannot be compelled to provide access to that software, because, for example, it doesn't meet the threshold of a refusal to deal, or there's still some marginal degree of competition at issue, repairers will need to turn to kind of self-help strategies. And so this is the second layer of competition-related or oriented policy solutions that's needed to protect independent repairers from liability for reverse engineering and hacking. And this is where two proposed bills in Canada, now also before the Senate, are looking to make some changes to the Copyright Act. The first is Bill C-244, and this bill proposes to include a new exception in Canada's Copyright Act that allows TPM circumvention, so in other words, cracking those digital locks, for the sole purpose of diagnosing, maintaining, or repairing a product. And this type of exception is desperately needed for independent repairers because the penalties for unlawful circumvention are enormous. A 2017 decision of Canada's federal court awarded $22 million in damages against a video game shop that circumvented Nintendo's TPMs in their video game consoles. And in order for repairers to devise their own solutions where manufacturers won't provide them, they need this type of certainty. They need this clarity that's in the Act. The second and last little sort of bit of legislation that we'll look at is Canada's Bill C-294, which is also now before the Senate. And the bill is meant to fix inadequacies in the existing interoperability exception. And it allows circumvention of TPMs to make a program or device in which it is embedded interoperable with any other program or device. And so with ubiquitous computing and the physical embodiments of software all around us, the concept of interoperability needs a bit of a refresh. And this is what C-294 is trying to do by expanding the scope of that exception to also include embedded devices and components, so making two devices work together. So the Polish train example, really making two devices, the part and the train itself as being kind of independently computerized devices, making them work together is the kind of the target here. So if we were to take a step back and think of the right to repair in its larger context and the various approaches and characterizations that went over in the very beginning, these proposed changes in Canada are examples of really competition-oriented solutions. They're by no means exhaustive in solving all of the impediments to repair. And Canada, again, should by no means be understood to be the shining light or a perfect example. But these types of solutions are headed in the right direction. They're essential for enabling independent businesses and technicians to move forward in a lawful and productive way. So with all of that in mind, I just wanted to make some concluding thoughts and observations about this market competition view of the right to repair and a policy approach. The first is that the right to repair is not only really a consumer right, but it's also about commercial fairness and the ability to compete in the marketplace. The second is that enabling independent repairers to conduct business benefits everyone. It lowers costs and it increases choices for everyone. The unrepairability problem transcends every conceivable device and product, many of which are not really in consumer markets at all. And think of things like medical devices, commercial equipment, the McDonald's milkshake machines are another example, notorious example, and even things like public infrastructure when we think of trains. So policymakers and legislators need to follow through on competition-oriented solutions to enable the right to repair, to really make it full-fledged, and to give independent businesses what they need. And this requires both a recalibration of various intellectual property rights and greater clarity and specificity of competition laws. So that's all I have, and I hope there was something for everyone to take away. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anthony. That was fantastic. It's raised lots of questions, which I'm sure will, there's a chat going for people online as well. It's great to see some similarities between Australia and Canada as well. So Next, I would like to introduce the Honourable Pat Keane, ACKC, who's a former member of, or retired member of the High Court of Australia, and very importantly was on the High Court when Caladad, our right to repair decision was decided for printer cartridges, as Andrew Lee spoke about. Very important decision for Australia. Pat is also an international judge on the Hong Kong Final Court of Appeal, and I invite Pat to come up and make some comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leanne, and thank you, Professor Rosborough, for that most stimulating and comprehensive paper. I would like to take up Professor Rosborough's points about competition, but from an Australian perspective, and rather than with a view of the interests of consumers, more with a rather more abstract view of the national interest. One of the problems with online attendance at occasions like this is that interaction becomes a challenge. And I would actually quite like to know how many of the audience at this evening's event practice as intellectual property lawyers or are in the process of becoming intellectual property lawyers. Are there any in the room? Not surprisingly, there aren't any. I wonder if there are any online. I would be interested to hear. Leanne tells me there aren't any. Yes. Well, she's not part of the problem. But opposition to the recognition of the right to repair in any of its manifestations will be organised and led by intellectual property lawyers. I'm not saying that they're bad people. No doubt they love their children and their families, but they are different, not just from ordinary folk, but from other lawyers. It's my experience that intellectual property lawyers constitute something of a form of a priesthood. At least they share some characteristics with enclosed religious orders. They are certainly true believers in the sacred importance of intellectual property rights, and patent rights in particular. In most patent cases, the issue is as to who gets the benefit of the monopoly conferred by the patent. The biggest patent cases are rarely about protecting third parties or the public from the anti-competitive effects of the patent. Rather, the biggest patent cases usually play out as contests between monopolists on the one hand and would-be monopolists on the other as to who gets the benefit of the monopoly. They are conducted by lawyers and very often in front of judges who have been drawn from the ranks of those lawyers. They are conducted by intellectual property lawyers, all of whom have drunk deep from the well of the notion that the monopolist's profit assured by the grant of a patent is a necessary stimulus to technological innovation for the greater benefit of the community. And it may be said immediately that there is much to be said for that view, but it is not all that there is to be said. Benjamin Franklin, the original and arguably the greatest inventive genius produced by the United States of America, he was the inventor of the lightning rod, which prevented churches across Europe being burned down in electrical storms. He was also the inventor of bifocal spectacles. He refused to take out a patent on any of his many inventions because he deeply believed that the products of human creativity should be freely available to all of us in virtue of our common humanity, especially given the fundamental economic fact of our interdependence on each other as the social animal par excellence. But even if we subscribe with a whole heart to the theory that the incentive to technological innovation provided by the patentee's monopoly is a great public good, we should at least be watchful of overreach by monopolists, even though they are state-sponsored monopolists. Without scrutiny and left unchecked, intellectual property lawyers will help their clients to overreach. That's their job. We know this because of the grotesqueries like the attempt to patent the implications for human health and treatment of disease of the discovery of the human genome that was rejected by the High Court of Australia in Darcy and Myriad Genetics, Inc. in 2015, 258 CLR 434. Patents are about inventions of useful things, not the discovery of truths about nature and the universe, just as copyright doesn't subsist in ideas, but in the form of their expression. Over the last couple of decades in Australia, the important checks upon the overreach of intellectual property lawyers and their clients have come when the intellectual property lawyers have come into contest with competition lawyers. Dr. Andrew Lee is obviously someone who, like me, is very impressed by Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction and the benefits of vigorous and unimpeded competition. Competition lawyers are professionally acculturated by their training and experience to view with great scepticism any derogation from the general hostility of statute law since the time of the Statute of Monopolies to the time of the Competition and Consumer Law, and of the common law to restraints upon trade and competition in the marketplace and restraints upon alienation. In this context, I want to mention the decision of the High Court in Caladad and Seco Epsom in 272 Commonwealth Law Reports 351. In that case, Seco manufactured and sold computer printers and printer ink cartridges. The cartridges was the subject of two of Seco's patents. They were manufactured and sold in a form which permitted only single use, so that the cartridge had to be replaced when the ink ran out. A third party obtained empty cartridges and modified them so they could be refilled and reused. Caladad acquired these modified cartridges and imported them into Australia for sale to the public. Seco alleged that this infringed its right to exploit its invention. Before the very excellent intellectual property lawyers who constituted the Federal Court at first instance and on appeal to the full court of the Federal Court, Seco was successful. Section 13(1) of the Patents Act 1990 of the Commonwealth gave a patentee the exclusive rights during the term of the patent to exploit the invention and to authorise another person to exploit the invention. The term exploit was defined to include where the invention was a product, to make, hire, sell, or otherwise dispose of the product, use or import it, or keep it for the purpose of doing any of those things. The majority of the High Court, consisting of the Chief Justice Kiefel, Justices Bell and Gageler and me, held that SECO's right to exploit its invention in any of the prescribed ways was exhausted on the first sale made by SECO. And so its patents were not infringed by the importation and sale by Caladad of the modified refilled cartridges. The decision of this majority, 4-3 decision, restored the authority of the decision of the High Court in Menk's case, 1908 7 CLR 481, which had been overruled on appeal by the Privy Council in 1911, 12 Commonwealth Law Reports 15. The view of the majority in Caladad accords with the view long held in the United States and recently reaffirmed by the US Supreme Court in Impression Products and Lexmark International, 2017, Supreme Court 1533, a case very similar to the circumstances of Caladad. The judgment of the High Court in Menk's case, which commended itself to the majority in Caladad, was written by the judge after whom this university is named. Chief Justice Griffith viewed the monopoly right conferred by a patent as a carve-out from the general law. Patent law was to be understood, in His Honour's view, as operating within the framework of established legal principle. Established legal principle since the Statute of Monopolies. It being, as His Honour said, an elementary principle of the law of personal property that the owner of chattels has an absolute right to use and dispose of them as he thinks fit, and that no restrictions can be imposed upon this right except by positive law or by his own contract. Unquote. The perspective underlying the different view in the Privy Council, to which the minority in Caladad was willing to adhere, was that the exclusive right of sale of a product embodying a patented invention stands over and outside the general law and these fundamental principles of the general law to which I've referred. On that view, this right conferred by a patent may be exercised even after the product has been disposed of. This commercial absurdity being ameliorated by the fiction of an implied right in the purchaser to deal with the product. We have long since turned our face against fictions in the law. As I say, however, the minority in Caladad, consisting of Justices Gordon, Nettle and Edelman, adhered to the view in Menk's case. In that view, when a patentee sells a product, a patented product made by it, remember the patent right to make a product embodying the invention, and to sell that product. When the patentee makes and sells a product, it retains, remarkably, as it would seem to anyone who has not drunk deeply of the Kool-Aid provided to intellectual property lawyers, the exclusive right to sell the same product. Again, subject only to the destruction or revocation of the licence impliedly given to the first purchaser to use and resell the product. In this view, a patent right resembles a magic pudding. It offers the patentee the right to cut and come again, to exercise the right to exploit the product after that right has been exercised for the life of the product. This is, and was always, an unprincipled and unjustifiable interference with the ordinary course of commerce and the ordinary understanding of everyone. That if I buy a product without agreeing to some contractual reservation on my right of alienation, I may deal with that product as I see fit in my own interest. And the law, since the statute of monopolies and the common law of against restraints on alienation and against restraints of trade, has always recognised that to be the case. The United States of America is one of the world's great manufacturing nations. It has an obvious national interest in the promotion of manufacturing in the United States, and therefore in promoting innovation in terms of US manufacturers and upholding the strongest view of US patent rights consistent with the United States national interest. But as Impression Products and Lexmark reminds us, even in the courts of the United States, it is recognised that to stifle vigorous competition by a broad and untrammelled reading of the patentee's rights to exploit its invention by treating it as a magic pudding is unacceptable. At a broader and more general level, over time, the acceptance and encouragement of the mindset that accommodates this broad reading of patent rights can have a debilitating effect upon a nation's economy. It's instructive, I think, to contrast the perspective of the US judges for whom for a long time, certainly since the Clayton Act and the Sherman Act, but even before, free competition is the basic value of prime importance, so far as the public interest is concerned. Contrast that mindset with the perspective of the Privy Council in Menk's case and of the minority judges in Caledad, by which free competition is relegated to a second-order consideration, by which the general principles of the law within which the Patent Act operates are ignored in favour of the broadest possible reading of the rights conferred by the Patent Act. The mindset of the Privy Council in Menk is a mindset that favours the feather bedding of established dominant players in a market by its assumption that established privilege is to be protected and perpetuated. It afforded the British monopolist the quiet life in business that is the goal, the ultimate goal and the ultimate reward of every monopolist. And the quiet life is the life of a manufacturer who has no interest in innovating, no interest in innovation, because if you've got the product that has market share, the last thing you want is a product that competes with it for market share. Over time, the enjoyment of the quiet life leads to the debilitation of a nation's economy. At the time of the Privy Council's decision in Menk's case, Britain was the dominant manufacturing nation in the world. It had begun the Industrial Revolution. It had led the Industrial Revolution for 150 years. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had become only a frail shadow of the manufacturing powerhouse that it had been. Of course, I don't suggest for a moment that this debilitation occurred because of the loopy decision of the Privy Council in Menk's case. But I do suggest that the mindset which accommodated the overreaching view of the monopoly granted to patentees was very much of a piece with the mindset that accepted the feather bedding of British industry against energetic and discomforting but legitimate and essential competition. So, as Professor Rosborough has said, legislation in this area is necessary. Legislation is necessary to prevent intellectual property rights being invoked to prevent competition. It will be of vital importance in relation to the formulation and passage of that legislation that competition lawyers continue to keep a sober eye on the overreaching enthusiasms of the intellectual property lawyers. An example of that enthusiasm can be seen in the New York legislation to which Professor Rosborough referred, where the legislation has excluded intellectual property rights from the reforms to protect the right to repair.
Thank you very much, but that was excellent. And I can say that my students and probably all intellectual property lawyers took such delight when you used the phrase the magic pudding in a High Court judgment. It was just joy. Thank you again to Anthony and Pat for your contributions this evening. We know that we have gone over time, but I wouldn't like to let Anthony and Pat leave without the opportunity to hear their views on some of your questions. So if anyone has any questions, I'd ask Anthony and Pat to join me up here, and I invite people online. We'll have a couple of questions if you don't mind staying. Thank you. Anthony, would you like to make any reply to Pat's comments? Or you've also read Caledad, I know.
Well, one thing I was afraid to admit is that I am a recovering intellectual property lawyer. That was fantastic. Thank you. One thing that I've noticed in my conversations with policymakers on this issue is frequently we hear this sort of pushback on the basis of national security. Now, in the last 5, 6, perhaps 10 years, we've seen increasingly intellectual property become intertwined with these conversations about national security, perhaps reflecting the kind of geopolitical tensions that we're in. And it's made convincing policymakers to enact exceptions to intellectual property even more difficult, because now we have not only the intellectual property lawyers to convince, but we have this kind of
It's the spooks too.
Yeah, impenetrable force of national security. And I'm just curious to hear.
There's nothing quite like harnessing. There's nothing quite like harnessing the force of paranoia. But I can accept that. I can accept that there's legitimate scope for concern about matters of national security, but not in relation to whether or not you can be allowed to sell a cartridge where you've put ink back in it and you can use it again. No doubt there is a lot of scope in a lot of intellectual property for legitimate concern about security. But there's a vast area where there is absolutely no basis for that sort of concern. And our problem, the problems of consumers, the problems of the national interest in a vigorous competitive economy can and should be addressed without legislators being spooked by these very, very narrow concerns.
Thank you. We have a couple. Are there any questions, Mary? Thank you. Just in the room, and then I'll come to the online questions.
Yes. Thank you both so much. That was brilliant, really engaging, fascinating, obviously, across the board of relevance and interest, I think, the whole community. But I suppose both of you really had a bit of a crack, and especially you did, Pat, at intellectual property. And is there, I'm not sure about a right to, but is there a need to repair intellectual property, and how much of these problems could be resolved by doing that? But thank you both so much. Amazing.
I'll say something first. The title of my future fellowship is Unlocking Intellectual Property, and one of the biggest challenges, and Anthony and I, and I'm sure Pat will agree, is the world is being measured by the World Intellectual Property Organisation around which countries are most innovative, and innovation generally is measured by the number of patents that are registered. So we are seeing across all forms of intellectual property, the more registrations of designs, patents, that shows an innovative country according to the World Intellectual Property Organisation. There is no concern around the exceptions or limitations, or whether a patent that is granted is a good patent, or whether a design that is registered is a good design and environmentally friendly design. And these are some of the research questions that Anthony and I constantly talk about.
And I think one of the most difficult questions that needs to be answered that we're struggling with is the incentive theory, the utilitarian idea that intellectual property will always lead to a kind of incentivization of innovative activity, where clearly we know, at least with Caladat and in other cases that we talked about today, that it can act as very much an impediment to innovation. And so if, at least in some cases, offering exclusive rights promotes innovation, then we need to have a better idea of where those need to be emphasized and where they need to be de-emphasized. And I think when it comes to repair, we see a clear case where we need to dial things back. But it's having those conversations with the folks who are actually at the helm of crafting policy is incredibly difficult, because, you know, in Canada anyway, you know, you've got MPs and they're being told a million different things from different people. You know, they're being told to go left and go right at the same time. And it's really difficult to kind of have a coherent narrative about the recalibration of IP in this kind of world of a very different type of innovation that took place even 30 years ago. So.
Can I just add, with the retrospective about 30 years ago, in the largest firms in Australia that were doing intellectual property work, within the same sections within those firms, you would find the competition lawyers. It's the growth of the silos. It's the narrowing of expertise. that's happened over the last 30 years that has, I think, narrowed the focus of the intellectual property lawyers in a way that has meant that we've now got a generation who don't have the balance that previous generations have had, because they've actually practiced both as competition lawyers and as intellectual property lawyers, and they've had to live with the competing values and reconcile them. And when you do get the competition lawyers and the intellectual property lawyers together, you do eventually work out that there is the general law against which, as Chief Justice Griffith said, or in the context of which patent law operates. It isn't outside and above. It's not a separate stream. It uses common law terms. It uses concepts that are familiar parts of the general law. What is noteworthy about litigation over the last 10 years has been, as I said, that when it's a contest about the existence of the patent, the revocation of the patent, contests between patentees, and these are the major contests in which the intellectual property lawyers are involved, the public interest in vigorous, effective competition just doesn't get a mention.
I think that's very true. And also what we're seeing is the intellectual property lawyers are representing global giants across all industries. And what we're seeing is the opposition and the level of funding and power of the opponents to the right to repair movement, whether it's in automotive, agricultural industries, medical devices and assistive technologies, the software industry, they're very big players. And I think these are the challenges for the right to repair movement, is that we don't have that kind of funding and that ability to oppose in every country around the world, because the same arguments of, as Anthony said, privacy, security, intellectual property, which is one of their favourites, you're all going to kill yourselves and die if you fix anything. They're the common arguments that we hear in Europe, in New Zealand, Australia, Asia and United States. I need to turn to the online questions. We have a couple for you, Anthony, if that is all right. We have one for Marguerite. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll just skip down. Could you please expand more on the product-based approach that some legislators have taken with regards to the right to repair? I'm particularly interested in knowing what basis the legislators choose those product categories.
So the product-based approach, I guess, is the prevailing one, that we're seeing across jurisdictions all across the world. And really that is a kind of focus on certain products or devices that seem to pose the biggest repair challenges and for which there are relatively easy policy solutions. The common ones that we see, of course, are home appliances, consumer electronics, sometimes the automotive industry, sometimes agricultural equipment, depending on the jurisdiction. In terms of that approach, I mean, I think, at least in Canada, we've seen the government sort of conduct public consultations or a pre-consultation to kind of narrow what those categories will be. Governments elsewhere have kind of just had expert-driven research, like the European Commission carried out a bunch of research to figure out what those 11 product categories should be. So that, there's not really a magic to that approach, but there are some common themes that we see jurisdictions doing. And I think my point in referencing that was that while that's a really, important first step, that it tends to preserve a kind of it tends to not really touch the source of the problem. It tends to preserve the exclusive distribution channels of manufacturers, because often those obligations are really just kind of asking permission rather than preventing the exercise of IP in anti-competitive ways.
Thank you. And I'm from Jessica Coates. Are your new Canadian laws compliant with NAFTA?
Well, sorry, and the name of the person was? Jessica. So Jessica may know that NAFTA has been replaced by the Canada, United States, Mexico agreement, also known as CUSMA. Are those laws compliant? Well, yes. So there's a long-winded answer to that, and
you can email Anthony.
Yeah, we can have a conversation about Article 20.66 of CUSMA. Yeah, send me an email. Yeah,
I think that is something that we often hear, that certainly from our federal government, that if we tinker with IP laws, that they've been told that we'll breach every free trade agreement that Australia has entered into, which is something that's also commonly argued.
Can I make a point on that, though? So what's common in a lot of international trade agreements being negotiated now is a provision called source code. And this is found in the digital trade chapters. And these actually do pose a risk for really important right to repair legislation, because they prevent governments from forcing manufacturers to provide access to software. So there is a threat there. Those provisions are increasingly common, and they're something that we should be concerned with. It was not the subject of today's talk, but there's an issue there for sure.
And just in closing, I think, and Pat, you probably would know this, but in Australia, we're finding much more joy from our competition bodies, the ACCC, Andrew Lee as a minister, than perhaps we are with the Attorney General's Department, with an understanding that copyright and TPMs, digital locks, are in our houses, in our homes, in our businesses, in our cars, in our tractors, and yet there is still the kind of misunderstanding that copyright exceptions really belong to archives, libraries, cultural institutions and educational institutions, as they have for the last 20 to 30 years. So that is something that we're fighting here. But I'm very grateful for all of you with your time. There are no further questions online. If there's no further questions here, I would like to once again pay particular thank you to Anthony. I've loved having Anthony here. It's been wonderful, a great opportunity to collaborate, and I thank the Australian Research Council and Griffith University the Law Futures Centre for having Anthony here with me. We've been very productive with our collaborations, and I thank again Pat for coming along tonight. It's been wonderful to have your thoughts as well. And thank you everyone for your attendance tonight and for your attendance online. We really appreciate your support. And if you are interested in following the right to repair debate in Australia, you can sign up to the Australian Repair Network. And if you want to follow Canada, you can then join Can Repair with Anthony as well. So thank you once again.